This is the story of the Woodland creature. This creature has appeared in many players' worlds, and all of them use the same description of this creature. It is described as a dark, shadowy figure. There are common trends among the multiple stories of this creature and where it comes from. But today, we will be following this player's story of the Woodland creature and the terrors it brings. One day, our player had decided they wanted to explore their world, as they had only been in their spawn area since they started. They wanted to find villages, other biomes, and maybe even temples, so they could get materials and treasures they did not previously have. Grabbing their iron armor off the stand, they had set out to begin exploring the wilderness of their world in the hopes of finding treasures. The player had been wandering for a little bit now, traveling to many places in the world like barren deserts and the cold tops of the tall mountains. And yet, still, they didn't seem to find anything they were hoping for. But still, they pushed forward. It was getting dark now, and the player was beginning to grow tired of walking, so they had set up a camp for the night in a flatlands biome. Roasting the meat and cooking the food they had found along the way there, they sat and looked up admiring the beautiful night sky until their food was done. Once finished eating, they headed to bed for the night. The next morning, the player had woken up in their tent to see their camp had been ravaged and torn apart. They were confused as they were the only ones in their world, and they had previously lit up the area so that no mobs would spawn near them. Yet, still, there was his camp completely destroyed. He stepped out of his camp, looking around at the damage when something caught his eye. A forest, more specifically a dark oak forest, that hadn't been there before. Curious to what, or how the forest got there, he began to head towards it. The player walked towards the forest cautiously, with sword in hand, ready to defend himself if they needed to. As they got closer, they got an odd feeling from the forest. Something about it just didn't sit right. The forest seemed more dense than it should be. The player was barely able to see between the trees. Once they were at the forest, they saw a path leading into it, and headed towards it. The path led deep into the forest and looked overgrown to the point where it was barely visible. It had lamps along the path that were either broken or weathered beyond belief. The player looked down the path as it had been the only spot between the trees where anything was visible. The player was scared but intrigued by the mysterious forest and what was inside it. The player continued to stare down the path, unsure of whether to venture further into the forest or to go back home. The player gripped their sword a little more until they saw something a little down the path cross over into the other side of the trees. Stunned, the player watched as it crossed. All they had seen was a shadowy black figure. They were unable to make out distinguishable features because of the distance the figure was at. Wanting to find out what it was, they ventured down the path of the forest. Once across the threshold of the forest, they turned around and suddenly, the opening that had previously been there was gone, and was replaced with trees everywhere. With nowhere else to go, they continued down the path. The players saw the creature again down the path, and began to run after it. They continued to run for what seemed like an eternity, chasing it through the dense forest, dodging and weaving between trees, without any luck of finding the creature or whatever it was. The player wanted to set up another camp, but had no materials to do so. So they began to chop down one of the multiple trees in the area. When they chopped the first block of one of the trees, they heard a loud shriek from the tree. Then immediately, they were hit with a blindness effect. Panicked, the player began to try and find a place to back up into. They eventually found it and gained their sense of their surroundings. Finally regaining their vision, they were met face to face with the creature. It was dark and shadowy, with bright green eyes staring at the player. Terrified, the player began to run, looking for an exit to the dark oak forest. The creature chased after the player, attacking them as they ran between the trees. Every time the creature hit them, the player would get blindness, making it harder for them to navigate. As the player ran, they saw the path they left behind previously. They began to run down the path, seeing the opening to the grasslands biome. Thankfully, the player made it out of the seemingly endless forest. The player turned around and saw nothing down the path. The creature that previously chased the player seemed to have vanished. Panicked, the player logged off for the day. The next day, the player logged on, as they were met face to face with the forest once again. It was now noon, and the player was pacing back and forth in front of the path. Then, they heard shrieks from the forest, and decided that they no longer wanted to go in. Just in case though, they had marked down the location of the forest, and began to retrace the path back home. Once home, the player decided to gather more resources before heading back there. They went mining for several days and got themselves better armor. The armor that was once iron was now a diamond set, standing up in their home. And on top of that, the player was also enchanted with their diamond chestplate, holding protection 2. With the last 2 diamonds they had, the player had decided to make a diamond sword. The player had also gathered a multitude of foods for the journey back to the forest. Feeling much more confident in their gear, they began to head back towards the forest. The player was about halfway through their journey when they saw the forest. The forest had grown out. Not only that, it had grown towards the player's home. The player didn't know what to do. They were stuck standing there in fear. The player began to run home and try and prepare to defend their home. The player began preparing by building walls around their base to see if that would cut off the forest. They also began to gather flint in order to make flint and steel to see if burning the forest would work. Running out of ideas, the player attempted to burn it all down as the forest grew closer, but this failed. The fire never even spread. Instead, it just got put out no matter how much the player tried or how much fire they placed down. It simply never worked. The forest kept getting thicker and thicker, closer and closer, until it had completely surrounded the player's home. Their attempts to stop the trees had failed. The player's home was now overgrown and covered with vines. These vines seemed to have weird effects on the house, making it decay faster than it normally would. Over time, the house was completely in shambles, and could barely even be called a home anymore. With the forest being overgrown and the house completely surrounded, the woodland creature began to feel more confident and comfortable in its new habitat, attacking the player more than it did before, coming out from anywhere like trees, dark corners, or even from behind a trunk of a tree. It also began to destroy the house or anything associated with it. Not sure what to do, the player grabbed as many materials as they could from their home after they began to run away. But the creature seemed to be at every turn, hitting the player and making them turn the other way. If the player did manage to get past the creature, they ended up running back to the house. It was as if the forest was shifting around the player to keep them there forever. After spending days in the forest, the player's armor was almost broken, and the tools they had were gone. The player stood in the destroyed house and looked up. The sun was gone, and all that was there was a dark sky. No sun, no stars, just darkness, with only one lantern to keep the area around them lit up. The lantern felt safe, as if nothing could happen as long as they had it. After spending days and days of relentless attacks, the player was almost out of materials. The player felt as if they were being watched from every corner of the forest, as if eyes were constantly on them, watching their every move. They felt like if they made a single mistake, the creature would take that chance and finish off the player. Slowly but surely, the player ran out of food. They tried to chop down more trees in hopes of finding apples in them, but this only seemed to make the creature angrier and cause them to attack the player more often. And, with having no way of getting food, the player couldn't regenerate the health they lost, making every hit from the creature seem more lethal than the last. The player noticed the forest getting thicker, but they couldn't do anything about it, and just watched as more trees grew. For some reason, they were growing faster than before and just completely surrounded the player. Unable to do anything else, the player sat there. They had completely given up. And so, the player looked up one more time. They were met with the face of the creature one last time before hearing a loud shriek. The creature then dealt the final blow to the player. After the final blow had been hit, the player's game had crashed, and the player could not get back into that world. But inside of the world, a tree grew right where the player had died. Satisfied, the creature gave one last shriek as he gained another tree for his never-ending forest. Have you seen the woodland creature? Do you think it's just legend? Comment down below. As well as comment down below any other stories you may have heard of, and we may cover that topic. Thank you to my super supporters, and as always, I will see you next time.